Hi, folks. I've been asked the question, what was the primary reason why the Allies were victorious in the Second World War? And given all the factors that were in play that brought Allied victory, I'm not sure that I can come up with an absolute answer to that kind of question. But certainly there were many important reasons why the Allies won the war. One is population advantage. If you look at all the Allied countries and the millions of people who live there versus the Axis, there's a clear advantage. The Axis nations are badly outnumbered. Another factor in Allied victory is the Allied achievement of air supremacy, both in the European theater and in the Pacific. So as the war progresses, the Allied air forces gain control of the skies. And in modern warfare, that's a huge advantage. It meant that Axis forces were effectively vulnerable. Anytime they moved, especially during daylight, they were subject to strafing and bombing. So air supremacy is an important factor in Allied victory. Another one is industrial output. The Allies win the production war clearly, and it turns out that countries like the United States proved to have a huge capacity to crank out war goods, both supplies like food and also the weapons of war. It's also been pointed out that the Allies, especially the United States and Britain, were much more effective at utilizing women and the labor of women during the Second World War. Nazi Germany had an ideology that basically emphasized that women should be homemakers and mothers, and Hitler and his government were reluctant to mobilize women into factories and into wartime pursuits until fairly late. When they realized that it was a necessity, they did it, but they lost a lot of time. I think another factor in Allied victory in the Second World War is the Allies' winning of the intelligence war. Most important Axis codes were broken by Allied code breakers. Also in the realm of spying and espionage, the Allies successfully used double agents to basically feed the Axis false information. And so the Allies, by virtue of the breaking of Axis codes and the cracking of the Germans' Enigma machine, knew much better what the enemy was up to than the other way around. And also the Axis or the Allies rather, were able to feed the Axis false information. And that's especially true in the build-up to D-Day, the landings in 1944 on the coast of France, where Hitler and his generals were basically fed incorrect information about where the landings were going to take place, and that dramatically slowed the German counter-offensive and allowed the Allies to get firmly on the ground in Normandy. Another reason why the Allies win the Second World War is catastrophic decisions on the part of the enemy. The invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, turned out to be a catastrophic misjudgment for the Germans, and the Japanese, their campaign in China, which bogged them down and inflicted huge casualties on the the Japanese armed forces. That helps explain in part why the Axis loses, that they were overly ambitious and attacked these targets, Russia and China, that proved to be too powerful for them to defeat. Another thing to mention, of course, is that the Allies win the war to turn out the first atomic weapons. And especially for the defeat of Japan, that's a critical element in convincing the emperor Hirohito and the Japanese government to give up the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'd also mention that on the side of the Axis in Europe, Nazi Germany, that the Holocaust is a strategic blunder. The decision by the Nazis to persecute and ultimately to commit genocide against the Jews of Europe made no rational sense. Many of the people who were victims of the Holocaust were German Jews who's, a generation earlier had fought loyally for the Kaiser, who were educated people who would have been an asset to the German state during war. And so large numbers of potential combatants are tied up in guarding and operating concentration camps. So the Holocaust is a wartime mistake. Apart from the horror and immorality of it, it doesn't make any rational sense from the viewpoint of waging war. So you have many of these different elements that all come together to help explain why the war ended the way it did. Throw in the fact that Adolf Hitler was probably mentally ill. Certainly he ranks up there as one of the great anti-generals of history. As a dictator, Hitler took over the major decision-making of the German armed forces and made bad decision after bad decision. And so the Germans would have been better off if Hitler had opted not to play general. In World War I, he had been a corporal, and so he had no background that really gave him the competence to make strategic decisions on that scale. So, hope you had a good week. We're coming up on the end of the term, so this is kind of a hectic time, but pretty soon we should all get a break, hopefully. So, talk to you folks later.